Welcome to the Education of a Financial Planner, where we look at the major concepts in financial planning through the lens of two quant investors who are learning the ropes of the planning process and how to help clients achieve their long-term goals. Learn along with us as experienced financial planner Matt Ziegler helps us understand the most important financial planning concepts that impact all of us and how we can apply them to achieve the best outcomes in our financial lives. In each episode, we will work through one major financial planning concept from the ground up and learn how we can apply it in the real world. From retirement to college savings to taxes to estate planning, we will cover a wide range of topics that apply to each of our everyday lives. We hope you will join us in our learning journey.
Justin Carbonneau and Jack Forehand are principals at Glidepath Capital Management. Matt Ziegler is managing director at Sunpoint Investments. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Glidepath Capital or Sunpoint Investments. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of Glidepath Capital or Sunpoint Investments.
Okay, guys, today we're going to continue this discussion around retirement and planning for retirement. What we've decided to do is segment the episodes out based on where a person is in their life stage. And the first podcast that we did it around early investors or young investors, and some of the key highlights there were just the standard stuff, starting early, the importance of compounding, and just sort of starting to think about retirement, when you're younger. But today's episode is going to be around probably the part of someone's life that is maybe it's most important. Maybe that's something we can talk about, but it's when someone's in their prime earning years. And that's generally when people are between 35 and 55. They're sort of in the prime of their career. They're maybe getting promoted, they're moving up the ladder, and they've got, more income to dedicate and put towards retirement. So we wanted this episode to be around the people that are in their prime earning years and how they should be thinking about and planning for retirement. So let's just start maybe at a high level. Matt, what would you say for someone that is in their prime earning years? What are the key considerations that they should be thinking about with regards to retirement?
So let's start with prime earnings and kind of flip that on its head a little bit. It's not so much just about prime earnings as it is about your prime savings years. And to connect it back to in the goals-based planning episode, we talked about what we use at Sunpoint unofficially and also officially as our 3 C's, which is calendar, cash flow, and crap. And that's calendar, AKA your timeline, AKA what happens to who and when, your cash flows, AKA your budget, AKA the money that comes in and the money goes out, and if it's in a surplus, a deficit, or break even, and then your crap, AKA your BS, AKA your balance sheet, AKA what you own and what you owe. So when we're talking about peak savings or your peak earnings years, we're talking about the period on the calendar when the money that's coming in is substantially more than the money that's going out, and allowing you to take that surplus and squirrel it away somewhere in your crap on your balance sheet, be it in your 401k, in a savings account, in a brokerage, paying off your mortgage, whatever it is. So the 3 C's apply first. The second thing, because we need more acronyms here, is we've got 3 E's. And in our professional work as planners, one thing we run into is 3 main types of archetypes of people for what they're doing when they get to those years. So we like to break this down into the first E is entrepreneurs, the second one is executives, and the third one is employees. And the key difference here is each of them have a different order of events and a different experience with this. Your entrepreneur might have the sale of the business contributing to their peak savings, or a few years that the business does astronomically well, and that contributes to their peak savings. The executive might have, they climb the corporate ladder to a point, and now they're getting a bunch of stock-based compensation or long-term incentive plans or whatever, and that contributes to their peak savings. And then the employees, well, they might be cash and bonus, and that might just be steadily climbing or achieving inside of an organization and figuring out when that comes. So the key considerations when we talk about peak earnings years, we're really thinking peak savings, and we're thinking if you're an entrepreneur, an executive, or employee, what contributes to your ability to save the most in that period.
One of the things that sort of tends to happen with some people is there's this idea of lifestyle creep. So as their income goes up over time, they tend to like more, buy more expensive things. Maybe somebody gets a raise at work and they go out and say, okay, I can now buy a new car. I think, given where we are all at in our lives with homes and kids and expenses that come up, it's hard for me not to say that I haven't been guilty of lifestyle creep. But Matt, how do you think people can give me some advice here? How can people avoid this?
Lifestyle creep is real. We think about it with the same disdain for self when we notice it, as the Radiohead song suggests. And the reality is we have to notice it. So before we talk about what to do with it, we have to talk about how to notice it. So lifestyle creep is literally the idea that money in versus money out, back to cash flow, is that the money that's coming in, the portion of it that's coming out, that part is creeping up faster than the amount of the money is coming in is rising. So we see this when we look at the cash flow against the calendar over two different periods of time. So we might go, great, we'll use an employee from the 3 E's from before. An employee starts off, they're making $50,000 a year, flash forward 10 years, now they're making $100,000 a year. Well, we want to look at a relative and absolute basis of their expenses. What's the money going out? And then compare them across those two periods of time. So the best employees figure out, I was making $50,000 a year. I had $30,000 a year in expenses. And then 10 years forward, when I'm making $100,000 a year, no lifestyle creep is I still only have $30,000 worth of expenses. That's a beautiful thing because now you've maximized savings by that growth in income. However, what a lot of people experience is $30,000, I start making some more money. Now I'm spending $40,000 or $50,000 or whatever. So lifestyle creep we see when we zoom out on the calendar and look at period over period, that those expenses keep pace with or rise or fall against our level of income that's coming in the door. Once we know it's there, we can address it. But step one is just noticing if it's happening.
So in our previous episode, we talked a little bit about the Roth versus traditional IRA or 401k debate. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about that. Now that people are in their prime earning years, or maybe earning the most they will in their life, like how do they think about that debate in like a time like this?
Anytime we talk about Roth versus traditional, what we're really talking about is we're talking about tax rate now versus tax rate later. And we're talking about if it matters more to get a deduction on putting money into a traditional IRA or a traditional 401k or something that gives us the deduction now, or if it'd be better off to have it later. The general rule of thumb says if my tax rate today is higher than my tax rate later, well, then I want the tax deduction today. Conversely, if I think my tax rate's going to be higher later, then probably what I want to make sure that I pay the tax today because I don't want to have to pay it later when I'm at a higher rate. So when we think about this in terms of like peak earnings and those peak years of where we're saving the money, we have to think about what puts the most money there. And then when I touch it later, how much is coming out because of this? So one way you can think of this is, and my partner, Ben Tusky at Sunpoint always says this, he calls it sort of the rule of 30%. And the idea is an individual filer, once you cross that like 180-ish $1,000 in income or 360,000-ish for the joint income, that's that line where that tax break on the pre-tax deduction starts to get really meaningful. So pre-tax, the more you make, getting that deduction might be really valuable. Also, if you're making higher income now, the odds that you're continuing to make that later in retirement are probably a little bit lower, which means your taxes are lower. If your taxes are lower, then getting the deduction now may be more valuable.
So it seems like in general, like this is the period in someone's life where if they're going to do a traditional, this is probably the highest likelihood that it'll work, right? Because they're probably in the highest tax bracket they're going to be in.
It's probably going to be most bang for your buck to do traditional in your highest earning years, because again, if you're crossing that rule of the 30% income tax threshold, then that tax break, it's hard to beat.
One of the things we've been doing a little bit more on our side with clients is this idea of Monte Carlo simulation. So I was just wondering if you could talk about, like, do you use that with clients, and, what is the value of that as a tool in terms of planning for their future in retirement?
So absolutely, we use Monte Carlo analysis, and just quick, like definitionally. So Monte Carlo analysis is we're trying to insert some randomness into something that we think is deterministic. And I'm probably butchering this, so the stats people can come after me for this. But the idea is if you have A plus B equals C, we might want to go like, okay, well, what if what not B? And the way I like to think about this or explain with clients why we do this is we're going to swap out B and we're going to insert FU. And we're going to insert F and U because we want to see what happens when we mess this thing up. And what Monte Carlo analysis does really well is it gives us the random variables that might train wreck our plan. And that might be the sustainability of income in retirement as one example. And so what Monte Carlo analysis does is it helps raise red flags that say, we've got some real problems down the road with this being sustainable. So now let's try to pre-address what those things are.
Do you do something, you'll see some planners will do this thing where they'll say, all right, I put everything in here and I get a sort of a probability as to whether this is going to work out in terms of achieving the client's goal. And, a lot of people seem to like use this like 90% number. I want like a number that's 90% or above. I mean, do you think there's value in that?
I think there's value in those confidence intervals, but I think this also comes back to, this is why it's critical to review the plan on at least like an annual business, at least an annual cadence, because you really want to know, am I still on track with my prior assumptions? And real life experience is always going to be more valuable than the forecast. Not real life experience like I can tell you what's going to happen in 20 years, but if I have to pay for something next year, it's probably a good time to check in and figure out where that money's going to come from now. And Monte Carlo analysis can't so much tell me as what's the likelihood I run into those things. The 80 to 90% in overconfidence levels are valuable. They shouldn't provide a false level of comfort. You have to be aware of the assumptions that could lead you to, especially if it's pushing you to be overly concentrated in any one product or idea. Diversification is still your best friend. But what I would say about that is more important than like the 90% confidence interval is probably remembering that are the assets in a diversified way going to give me 80% of my pre-retirement lifestyle income? And then with some smarts around it, knowing that people tend to spend somewhere closer to 50% of their assets down in retirement, like do all those things check out as I carry them through the periods? Monte Carlo and the confidence intervals are a way of sort of testing for that. But again, annual review is the only way you're going to know if it's actually working.
These prime years are probably a period where people are thinking a lot about, do I have enough money for retirement? And that sort of begs the higher level question is, how do you figure that out? And, that's probably a different episode to do, but I'm just wondering in general, like, how do you think about this idea of someone understanding whether they're saving enough for retirement, how much they're going to need when they get to that point?
The point I just made about on average, and these are what the studies say, about 80% of lifestyle you're going to need for in retirement. And that means too, everybody's situation is different here. So we might look and go, okay, your income is going to be, or is this while you're working. So when you stop working, we need to recreate most of that. So we'll use the 80% number. Now, do your assets, do your social security, does the pension that you're getting, does the dividends from the family business, whatever it is, how do those stack up in terms with what you expect that ongoing lifestyle expense to meet? So when we say how much does someone need for retirement, it's this composite exercise of gathering all this information and then going, okay, so you want to retire at 60 and you want to have $200,000 a year. All right. How do we back into all the different types of accounts, vehicles, and options to see if that's an achievable number or not?
Another thing people might be thinking about at this point in their lives is they've probably had a stock heavy allocation in their younger years for their retirement savings. But as they get older, they're sort of thinking about this glide path of, do I de-risk my portfolio and how do I go about the process of doing that? So I'm wondering just if you could talk at a high level about how people might be able to think that through.
So the glide path is an ingenious but simple idea. And most commonly it's referred to in terms of like your stock versus your bond mix. So it's this idea that the older you get, the less stock you should own and probably the more bonds you should own. Well, if the last 20 or so years has taught us anything, it's not so much, especially last year has taught us anything. It's not so much just the bond allocation, but it's understanding the volatility or variance of different points in your portfolio. And that's both the asset allocation, stocks, bonds, cash, alternatives, whatever, and your asset location, which is pre-tax, post-tax, etc. So the idea is as you get close to a spending need, you want to be reducing your variance, with the idea being going into 2022, for example, if you had your spending money in the ag and you had your spending money in stocks, you had a terrible year for both of those things. So if you're going to spend money the next year, knowing you have something readily convertible to cash with relatively low variance is the thing to do. The important part with glide paths is understanding, again, like across the board, what you actually need over some expected period of time. So you can still be like, it's okay probably that Warren Buffett is stock heavy in his allocation because he doesn't need that money to pay for the taxes on the house. It's not a rule, a hard and fast rule of thumb that applies to everyone. It's, do you have enough assets with low enough volatility or variance that you can use to draw from for necessary goals that you have to pay for in the relatively near future?
There's so many moving parts to this. And you mentioned the idea of an annual review before. I mean, do you think that's usually the appropriate time frame? I mean, is that how often it's a good idea to take a look at all this, see where we are, and kind of change the plan if we have to?
I think the big part of this, and we get this question a lot, like how soon should I start really planning for retirement? And I think there's a couple of things, and they're dependent on the type of the goal that you're trying to pay for. And back to the 3 C's, that's the idea of, if I'm converting part of my crap into cash flows to pay for something that's happening on my calendar, so I'm kind of working backwards through those 3 C's, like how do I do it? And how much runway do I need in advance to plan for it? So I'll give you the example. If you've been saving for your kids for college, probably by the time they're a junior or a senior, you should be adjusting the portfolio and have a pretty strong sense of where's the money going to come from to pay that first tuition payment and then the ones that follow. And generically speaking, an annual review to check progress towards that savings goal. And then when you get a year or two out, to have like a really technically focused, let's look at cash flows for the next 4 years and paying for college and plan this out becomes critical. Likewise, as you get closer to retirement and you start to go, here's my end date. I think, I'm going to turn 60 this year and I want to retire by the time I'm 65. That like 3 to 5 year window before something that's going to be maybe 25 years of retirement. Same thing. It's the annual reviews to check your progress to your goal. But then when you get close to one of those big life events, you have to really take a deep dive and then revisit everything so that when it's happening, your surprises have been mitigated.
I'm just curious, after a year like last year, how do you think about these annual reviews? I mean, this wasn't the worst bear market of all time, but for a stock and bond allocation, it was one of the worst periods of all time. So like when you're talking to clients, like how do you think about like adjusting a plan, or whether you need to adjust a plan after a year like that, that's such an outlier?
Time horizon matching of the investments to what you need them for. We mentioned it in the goals-based planning episode 2, Peter Mladina's work, Ashwin Chabra's work. There's a bunch of great resources on this. But the idea is you're going to have nasty years for one asset class that might not be a nasty year for another asset class. So stock zig when bond zag is one of the most famous correlations that we talk about. You can see it in factors and you can see it in other stuff too. You're also going to have years though where everything zigs and nothing zags, or the amount of things that zag are really hard to come by. And so after a year like 2022, or during a year like 2022, you got to really think about, again, if I was going to be dependent on some assets to meet some cash flow need, I needed to make sure in advance, not knowing if things are going to zig and zag or all zig, that I've got stuff to pay for those objectives. And this is like the critical part. So I'll use the scenario of, I saw this in the financial crisis, and then we certainly saw it at the beginning of COVID. People coming up to that retirement phase, if they hadn't planned cash flows for the next several years, use the financial crisis where it took stocks roughly 5 years to get back to their high watermark. If you hadn't had a conversation and plotted out your necessary cash flows and which assets you were going to sell from what part of your asset allocation and asset location to fund the retirement needs in those first 5 years, like you're going to be selling stocks at a loss to make your lifestyle work. And if you sold stocks at a loss to make your lifestyle work, you probably used up future years of consumption faster than you wanted to. Having that forecast and having safer assets set aside in a war chest to spend down through difficult years, which will inevitably happen, is really, really, really critical. And after a year like last year, when everything zinged and few things zagged, it's a super big deal that you're checking this out with somebody you can talk to.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, I think understanding what's possible is really important. And so, like a lot of people who have invested since 1980 didn't necessarily maybe think last year was possible. Their bonds had always been their hedge. And so, like understanding, like looking through full market history and saying, like, although this hasn't happened in a long time, this might happen, and it's got to be part of my plan that I can deal with it, is probably really important.
That's the value of Monte Carlo analysis, is the random swapping in of those variables. And again, not A plus B equals C. We're looking for like the A plus FU equals C, where something really screws you up in the middle and you got to be ready for that. And market history and prior experience is not going to be the thing that informs you. I also like to remind people that like Monte Carlo analysis is effectively Monty Python analysis, where we're taking logic and we're just turning it on its head. So if you didn't think that a year like last year was even possible, that was just the markets doing the dead parrot sketch to all of us.
This isn't a direct retirement vehicle, but I wanted to ask you about HSAs because it seems like that can actually be a pretty good long-term saving vehicle and has a lot of tax advantages. So can you just talk a little bit about how people at this point in their life might think about an HSA?
HSAs are pretty cool because they're triple tax exempt. So you get the deduction, then you get the deferrability. So like I can take money out, deduct it from my income, like a 401k, like a traditional IRA. I get to put it in, so then it can grow tax deferred. And then if I take it out to pay for, health savings account. So if I am paying for healthcare related things later in life, then it can come out with the tax deferred growth being fully applicable to my hospital bills or Medicare premiums or whatever. And now I don't have capital gains tax. So it's kind of a magic vehicle in that sense. The first thing you should know is you have to have a high deductible plan to be eligible to have an HSA. There's all sorts of stuff, whether you're self-employed or you're part of a corporation, where you can find out if you are in a high deductible plan or have access to one, you can fund one of these. Again, get the tax break, get everything else as it goes. And then just understanding like what's the context for this, because you're probably not going to skip your 401k to do your HSA. You're probably going to do a 401k with an HSA, maybe with a Roth and whatever else. So in the broader mix, it's a wonderful tool to have in the toolbox because of that triple tax exempt status, but it is by far from the only tool you're going to need to pay for things like medical expenses in retirement, which they can be a big part of everybody's retirement expenses.
I think one problem a lot of people probably have as they get in their primary years is they might look at their retirement balances and say, I'm getting behind. And I'm just wondering when people come to you with that problem, like how do you help them think through that and how they can sort of start the process of solving it?
If you feel like you're behind, you've already made the most important realization, which is that something's not right and something's not sustainable about the path that you're on. So this leads to some really real and hard conversations. And usually, to take it back to our question at the beginning regarding like lifestyle creep, usually this is a big piece of it. So when somebody says I'm behind on my retirement savings, we start to look at what are all the tools on the table. Let's look on the calendar when you want to retire. Let's look at the cash flows and what's achievable and what's not. And then let's look at the balance sheet and figure out what are the savings, what are the debts that you have, and how do we try to right this ship? The reality is, with most of these people, we start to block out, can we save on expenses? Is there anything that we can suggest you do that you're also willing to do? And then how can we get it there with a target, usually not a week or a month in advance, usually several years, if not decades in advance, to say, here's how you right this ship to get it maybe not back on track, because your track may not have been realistic to begin with, but get it onto a track that you're comfortable with so you can stick the landing and successfully get into your retirement.
It's interesting. There's a client that I work with. I think he's like early to mid 50s. Pretty successful guy. He's in like sort of like sales and he has like $1 million with us, and that's a lot of money. But what was in a conversation with him at one point, we were talking, And I said, if you were to be drawing off this portfolio today, you'd only be taking roughly 3.5 or 4% off the portfolio to, on an annual basis to, possibly live off of, using like the 4% rule as like the guide there. And I think that was very eye-opening for him. I think he thought like, and again, $1 million is a lot of money, but when you look at it in terms of what you're actually drawing off that on an annual basis, if you're in retirement, I mean, that's only $40,000 a year, and that's pre-tax, assuming it's coming from whatever IRA you're going to owe tax on it, or there might be embedded gains in something you're selling if it's a taxable account. So I don't know. The point is like, I think, sort of looking at it that way can be sort of a wake-up call for some investors to realize, holy smokes, like $1 million actually doesn't go that far when you look at it on what you need or what you might be taking out of it.
Understanding peak, not just peak earnings, but your peak savings years and how you're going to squirrel that money away is so important for this, because a lot of people don't realize, hey, it's expensive to retire. When the government talked about this retirement crisis for the last, 10 plus 10, 20 years, this is what they're talking about. Retirement's expensive. And so looking at the money you have and then understanding, playing that calendar forward a few years and saying, how do my assets convert into cash flows that support this lifestyle on an after-tax basis for my consumption? It's an exercise, and it can be done on paper. You can do it with all the fancy spreadsheets and tools in the world, or you can do it very simply. But the point is just to reverse engineer, how am I going to get to what I have so that when I trade, working for some form of income that pays for my lifestyle, for now the assets that I squirreled away are going to pay for my lifestyle. How am I going to make that transition? And that's where working with a financial planner is a huge deal, because they help you think through these problems. And like you with your client, like us with our clients, we haven't just done this once. It's that old Richard Thaler joke about, people will buy a house or get married and they make these giant decisions, and you make them once and you don't really get do-overs for those things. So it's really good to go get some input from some people who get to see this thing a lot of times, because these are big decisions and you don't really get do-overs.
Just to pick up on Justin's point, like if you sort of reverse that too, I was just thinking about Social Security, and like that actually is, that's an asset a lot of people probably don't account for as much as they could too. Like if you reverse what you're going to get from Social Security and like apply the 4% rule and reverse it into like the size of a portfolio, that actually would be like a significant portfolio that you'd be drawing 4% off of. So, how do you think about that? Like, how do you think about Social Security when you're thinking about people's planning?
So there are actually people, and there's not a right or wrong, who will take like Social Security and say, let's think about that like a fixed income part of your allocation. And they're usually doing this to say like, you should be comfortable with a bigger stock allocation. And that is the case for some people and not for others. But to that point, if somebody has $1 million, it's all in a pre-tax retirement account, and they're going to retire at 67 or something and turn on Social Security at the same time. Well, now we're going to say, okay, on the calendar, 67 through whatever age we think you're going to live through, that's our time horizon. Cash flows are, you're comfortable on $100,000 a year. Okay, well, your $1 million, that might only last 10 years alone, but now we insert things like Social Security and other stuff in the mix. So just quick back of the envelope, and this is out of my brain, so forgive all the calculating inconsistencies here, but it's like somebody needs $100,000 a year, 80% rule. They probably only need more like 80,000 unless they're doing anything crazy or one-off stuff. So they need 80,000 Social Security. Let's see what that is. That has tax preferential treatment. That might get them $40,000. So right off the top, we've gone $100,000 lifestyle, really $80,000 needed. Half that's going to come from Social Security. The other half is going to come from the retirement account, introduce tax frictions. Maybe it's a little bit of light. And now we're solving, okay, what's the lifestyle puzzles and problems with how do we make this meet with the money that you have left? Social Security, especially people in that sub 6-figure income class, going to be a huge part of their income in retirement. Can't overlook it. Somebody who's maybe getting 7 figures in retirement, that's a different piece. Social Security isn't a rounding error to them. We have to consider it a totally different way.
It would seem like your prime earning years are probably one of the most important times not to make mistakes. You're making the most money. You've probably built up a decent balance in your accounts. This is the time where you probably don't want to make major errors. I'm just wondering if you could talk about some of the major errors you see and maybe how people can avoid them.
The biggest error is just not realizing you're in your peak savings years. So when you're in your peak saving years, you have to have a plan, a mindful plan, mind you, where you're saying, I've got extra money coming in. I'm keeping my hand on top of those expenses so they're not rising with my income. I've got a awareness that next year might be a surprise. The gravy train might not keep rolling here. So I want to be smart. I want to, and I keep using this expression because I think it's the best one to think of. You're squirreling it away. It's the squirrel putting the nuts, hiding them in the tree, hiding them in the ground and get ready for winter because winter, extra Game of Thrones, is coming. So the biggest mistake in those peak earning years is failing to realize you're supposed to be squirreling some of this money away. And the more you can squirrel away, the more options, the more flexibility you're going to have later to work with as you reverse engineer how you're going to survive without getting a paycheck from job and now getting a paycheck from your assets from yourself.
So I had a good friend whose wife is a teacher, and she obviously will get, well, I'm in Connecticut, so she'll get the teacher's pension, but they also had this, I think she was supplementing that with like a retirement, like a 401, something like that, like some type of, qualified plan. And she was putting money in it. And at one point they looked at it. I actually think they hired a financial advisor. They went and looked at it. And what they realized was ever since she's opened it, they had it in the most conservative, mutual fund that was part of the plan. And, what kind of made me think of that is I worry that, a lot of times people don't even know what to do. So they just say, I'm just going to put it in this low risk, something that's getting 1 or 2%, maybe more now, given where rates are. Or if someone's first experience is they start investing during the financial crisis, or maybe the COVID crash, or kind of not, but their first experience in the market is a bear market, they may get so gun shy about investing that they have all these years left. They should be saving more aggressively, but because of those experiences, they either don't know what to select, or they feel like they've been so burned that they're so timid and so scared about investing in the market.
One of the most valuable things we as financial planners and financial advisors can do is help people understand sequence of returns risk and sequence of experience risk and make sense of those two things. So we want to be able to tell the person who is participating in the plan and is I don't trust the stock market or whatever it is. They don't have to invest in the stock market. They don't have to invest in highly volatile or things that have the highest return potential, but they do have to save more. And they have to understand that the track they're going on to get that. And so the order that we have experiences and that we're exposed to things like taking stock market risk or putting everything in the stable value fund in our teacher's retirement pension, having a professional who can talk to us about, okay, this is the good and the bad of doing the things the way that you're doing it, and making sure you're just comfortable with the path that you're on. That's, it's huge. And it also boils down to that annual review process or that regular cadence of checking in on this stuff and making sure it still aligns with your long-term needs, because that's where you start to get a sense of that resequencing of experiences, not just sequencing of returns. So you go, I didn't really like this, but I did like seeing my stuff go up over that 5-year period. The beginning of COVID was scary, but 8 months in, when I saw all the account values going up again, I went, crap, I wish I would have bought more. And talking to a professional is one great way to make sure you're noticing those little things and reinforcing that positive behavior.
Just before we wrap up quick, I wanted to ask you about emergencies. I mean, obviously, we've talked in previous episodes about how people should maintain an emergency fund, but one thing people think about when they put in money into IRA accounts, whether it's a Roth or a traditional, is what happens if something goes wrong that I didn't think of and I have to pull some money from these. So, and we can put a chart in the episode that kind of details all the stuff around this because this is actually quite complicated, but I'm just wondering in general if you could talk about some of the rules around if somebody does have an emergency and they do need to take money out of one of these qualified accounts, how that works.
So there are rules for taking out of qualified accounts, and that the first thing just to know is that there is help. And so if you're socking money away, you can also understand there are ways to get stuff out, but there are consequences to how you get it out. So in those pre-tax retirement accounts, there are things like hardship withdrawals, and there is a whole and unfortunately not terribly easy to understand but there's a whole list of different things. And your plan at work, or if you're a solo entrepreneur or you have your own corporate plan, these things sometimes can be amended or used, but the IRS's guidelines, they say what you can take out and under what circumstances. They say when a penalty applies, when regular tax applies, when it doesn't apply. 401ks, things like that, you can ask about hardship. Frauds, you can always take out principal that you put in. HSAs, they have their own requirements. 529s have their own requirements. You just have to understand what that backdoor looks like and know that if you have a bona fide emergency, there's ways for it to help. If you don't have an emergency and you just want money, there's often cases penalties to act as disincentives from you doing that.
In summary, and there's a lot that we've discussed here, but what kind of stands out to me is, Matt, I like how you kind of brought it from the prime earning years to the peak saving years. So you flipped it. We talked about the 3 C's again, the calendar, cash flows, and crap, but then we also brought in the 3 E's, which are the different types of people you have in their prime earning years. Entrepreneurs, executives, and employees. We talked about how to combat lifestyle creep. And I think matching your cash flows with your assets is a very important thing. And that's one thing that sort of jumped out to me when you're thinking about your cash flow needs, looking at your portfolio and saying, what assets can match to those potential cash flows and expenses. Yeah. And then I guess the back of the napkin envelope on how someone should think about Social Security and their investments as they sort of near retirement. I think thinking about that is important. And I think probably, and this isn't, supposed to be, what we're trying to do is just educate ourselves on these important concepts and hopefully, educate our audience along the way. But I do think a lot of this highlights the importance for many people to use a financial advisor or planner, because this is complicated stuff. Things are always changing. It's, this is a very important time in people's lives where they should be saving and thinking about retirement. And so hopefully this episode and the future episodes that we do, can help people along the way as we learn by doing these. So thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you next time. Hi guys, this is Justin again.
Thanks so much for tuning into this episode.
You can follow Jack on Twitter at @PracticalQuant.
You can follow me on Twitter at JJCarbonneau, and follow Matt on Twitter at CultishCreative.
If you found this discussion interesting and valuable, please subscribe in either iTunes or on YouTube, or leave a review or a comment.
Also, if you have any ideas for topics you'd like us to cover in the future, please email us at excessreturnspod@gmail.com. We would like this to be a listener-driven podcast and would appreciate any suggestions. Thank you.